bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the March 10th, 2026 episode. As our audience can see, my guest this week is Mark Shelburne. Mark is a housing policy consultant with Novogradac. This is also Mark's 10th appearance on the podcast. Now today, he's here to preview a 6-week online class that he'll begin teaching on March 26th. Now it's not 6 full weeks. It's 6 sessions over 6 weeks. It's 1.5 hour sessions a week. The focus of the class is the fundamental concepts of allocation and underwriting of low-income housing tax credit developments. Mark's been conducting these courses for 5 years, and it averages 150 to 200 attendees a year. It makes up the audience, housing agency folks, syndicators, developers, property managers, a real wide range of attendees. So Mark's here today to discuss an overview of the course, and I'm sure many of our podcast listeners will want to sign up. We have a lot to discuss today, so if you're ready, let's get started. Mark, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
As I said earlier, this is your 10th appearance on Tax Credit Tuesday, which also makes you the 10th guest to reach double figures, if anyone's tracking. All that said, I'm sure you're new to many in our audience. So before we get into our discussion, please describe some of the services you provide to Novogradac clients.
Yeah, so the primary service I provide is advising state housing tax credit allocating agencies. So I'm close to about half of them now around the country in my time with Novogradac with them as clients. And the main service that I provide from them is revising and ideally improving their qualified allocation plans, which implements the housing credit. But I do other things as well, help with application review, staff augmentation, apparently is the term for what I do sometimes. There have been some agencies that have lost their entire staffs. And so we stepped in to help out with running their programs. And so that's the main thing I do. But the second thing that I do for the firm is what we're about to talk about, which here is training. But it isn't just this. I do other kinds of training as well, but this is the main one that I do.
Now, some people who don't know all of your background might be thinking, so why does this public accounting firm think they're in a good place to be advising on allocation and underwriting? So please share some of your experience before you joined Novogradac.
That's a great point. Yes. So I spent where you and I met was when I was with the state housing agency in North Carolina. I was there for 13 very eventful years as the attorney and the policy coordinator there. And then I also spent about a year running the programs in Georgia and working for 2 different agencies. That really opened my eyes just to how different things can be from one state to the next. You think you know that until you really see it up close and personal. And so through those experiences is really where I gained the vast majority of my knowledge and ability to add value to agencies. But of course, now that I've worked with a couple dozen, give or take, I've learned a lot from that.
So let's jump into the training. What's the genesis of the course?
Well, so I'd been teaching the basics for a long time, including back when I was with the Housing Finance Agency. You and one of your partners had invited me in mid 2000s down to teach for the day-long seminar, which we still do as a firm. I went down to Miami for that. I'll never forget they lost my luggage and for my one-day trip, basically. So I've been teaching it for a very long time. I really enjoyed teaching the basics. It's a lot of fun. But where I got the idea for this specific course was because a friend of mine who teaches this material, this concept at UNC Chapel Hill, he teaches it in a class for which I had been a student in the mid 1990s. And so the only background I had in the housing credit before I started working in the field, sabbatical. And so he asked if I would teach this part of the class. The class covers a lot of other topics, but there's a component of it that's on the housing credit. And so I thought, oh, sure, it must probably be just like speaking at a conference. Well, boy, was I wrong. It was so much harder to teach, like really teach, than speaking at one of these panels at a conference. And so I'll never forget my students when they first gave me my homework back, like a lot of them got a lot of it wrong. And I thought, well, that's not on them. That's on me. I didn't teach
Right.
it right. And so I really learned a great deal. But one of the things I really learned from that experience is the value of homework. And that's something that we do as humans from basically kindergarten all the way through graduate school. But then once we become professionals, we stop doing that for the most part. And there's great reasons for that. It makes perfect sense. But I wanted to give the option for folks who wanted to try that and learn that way to have that as part of a class. And so that's the reason why it's actually spaced out over 6 weeks, is to give time between weeks for people to do homework assignments.
Well, hopefully that doesn't scare too many people off from joining the training. I mean, there's homework.
It is optional. I mean, obviously there's no way you're paying us, so it's not like I can penalize you for not doing the homework, but I try to make it as fun and interesting as I can. We did it just that way for a couple of years, but then we realized that we could offer a certificate. So that's the other reason for having it spaced out, is because after you take a class for that week, then you have the opportunity to take a 10-question quiz, basically. And
Got it.
So there's 6 of those, so 60 questions total. So if you do well enough on that quiz, then you can get a certificate from Novogradac saying you passed the course. And you don't have to do it that way. There's two. You can either do it with or without the certificate. Either way, you have the opportunity to do the homework, though.
No, great. I was obviously tongue in cheek about the homework. I said a bit about the audience and some of the different areas of the industry that you end up getting attendees. Any more you want to share about your past audiences and how you see the target audience?
Well, because at least some of the people who take the class will be truly beginners, like in their first weeks in the work.
Right.
Maybe their first months, because some of folks are in that circumstance. It truly does have to start at the absolute ground level. And so what that means is there are some folks who are a little further along for whom some of the content, at least in the first week, will be a little bit of review. But frankly, I think that's valuable. Heck, even now that I've been doing this work for definitely more than a compliance period, I haven't gotten to the extended use period yet, but I still will sometimes sit in a one-on-one class to see how it's done. And invariably we'll learn something. It's amazing how that is. And so you're always going to pick something up, but that's where it starts, is from the ground level. And so most folks are at or near that point in their careers, and that's who it's geared to.
No, I couldn't agree more. I always learn something, and I'm past my extended use period, but I'm still within the 55-year California,
there you go.
There are 55-year periods. So I haven't been in the industry that long, but I've been in more than 30 years, obviously. As you know, I've been in the industry since it started. So celebrating 40 years this year. But your point about learning something, I couldn't agree more, because I'm always learning something and be reminded of something that you're like, oh, that's right. I knew that, but it wasn't front of mind. So it's definitely great to get the refreshers. Well, let's jump into the various topics you're going to be covering. So maybe we take it week by week.
Certainly.
So each week has a theme. So maybe just take through each week, starting with week 1.
Right. So one of the other things I learned from the various ways in which I've taught this material is that you really have to provide and talk about a lot of the concepts more than once for it to really sink into people's heads. And so the first week is basically an introduction to the introduction. We talk about all the concepts we're going to cover in the class and just walk through them at a high level so that folks get introduced to the ideas. So when they hear them again, they're better able to sink in. But then after that first week, we move into the main heart of the course. And my sense of the way to teach this is that the key thing to understand for almost any part of this work is the calculation of the maximum housing credit amount. And I know that sounds esoteric, but it really underlies so much of what we do in this work. It's just fundamental to understand how that math works. And so I break that into the multiple steps. And the first step is, what is eligible basis? And a lot of people, when we start talking about the concept of eligible basis, which actually has been one of those 10 or 9 podcasts that you and I have done, we talked about eligible basis one time, is folks want to know, well, just tell me what counts and what doesn't. And there are some things that are obvious that do and don't count, but it's better to understand the concept of it,
Yes.
how it works, the principles behind it, because you never know what sort of random weird thing will pop up and you have to answer, how does this count? And so I just had one the other day. An agency was calling me and asking about someone wanting to have parking that was only for the market rate tenants, but then they paid for it. And so I had to think about the various questions you have to ask and answer to get to the right conclusions. So that's the first week is eligible basis. Then the second week, we talk about the next components.
Let me just actually interject with the eligible basis, because I also think when you were talking about the overall sort of concepts, I also just find that when you understand the policy reasons for the different rules, it also helps remember it as well. So you can say, okay, what's the guiding light? What's the overarching principles at play here? And they can help shine your light towards where the answer likely lies.
Exactly. When I teach this, a lot of times I'll refer back to this is what Congress was trying to accomplish, because it really helps to understand that. So the second week, we start talking about the other components, applicable fraction and the tax credit rate. And that's one of the more challenging weeks to do because I'm flying without a net. I have some slides, but for the most part, what we're talking about, me and the guests who we'll talk about in a second, have a spreadsheet up on the screen that we walk through and say, okay, now we're changing this number and here's what happens when you change that number. Obviously, considering what I just mentioned, what happens when you include market rate units, what happens when you make it from a 9% deal to a bond deal. And so you see them live action, which is why it's good that we record this so people can watch it later if they want. But there's nothing like seeing the spreadsheet and seeing it work and how it changes and moves. And so that's the second week. So you see those concepts.
Yeah.
So that then covers the 4 concepts, the 4 premises behind the calculation.
That ends up becoming the first 3 weeks, the intro, and then the eligible basis and the boost, and then the applicable fraction and tax rate, which is really low-income occupancy percentage and your credit rate. And like you said, looking at the spreadsheet and actually seeing live how the variables end up influencing ultimately your financing gap. And then the 4th week is?
Right. So the 4th week, we talk about equity investment. And that's the other reason I like to spend an entire class on that. What really makes the housing credit unique is the fact that it has this equity investment. Obviously, debt is very important, but the way debt works, there are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities too with this kind of debt and with other kinds of debt. Whereas the equity investment is completely unique. And so we spend a whole week talking about how equity investment works.
And that is the driver. I was speaking to a member of Congress yesterday, and I was just explaining the whole concept of equity. That is the foundation of the low-income tax credit, is having all this investor equity in the transaction. So you don't have to have as much debt to fund the development costs, which allows you to charge lower rents. That's LIHTC in a nutshell.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to week 5.
Right. So you would think it's just me being self-indulgent to talk about qualified allocation plans because it's my favorite topic since I've now done more than 60 of them. And maybe that is an element to it, but that's also where the implementation of the housing credit is through QAPs. And so that's how the agencies carry it out. So it's really important to try to understand those. And that's one of the main things I emphasize in the class is how easy it is to not understand them. And so how folks will think they know what they're talking about with the QAP and they're 180 wrong. And so it's important to realize how challenging this. That's what I try to express is just how difficult that can be in that class.
And I just try to also, when I think of the qualified allocation plan, that's the credit allocating agency, normally a state. That's their way of saying to the development community, this is the type of housing that we want to fund in our state. And it's incumbent upon developers to work with the state and help educate the state, developers and others, policymakers and the broader community as to how the resource should be used. And then understand as those rules get set, that's how the resource is being used. So they need to be leading in to how the state's using the resource. So let's go to week 6.
Right. Exactly. The weeks also are in something of a time sequence order,
Yes.
not exactly, but this last one is definitely a time sequence in that it's about post-award. And that's a topic that I really like to cover because it often isn't in various other forms. And so that's actually one of the first webinars I came up with for the firm, and we still do occasionally, is a whole, much longer than this. This is an hour and a
Yes.
half. We will have a 3-hour course that Wayne and I will do on post-award, which we've done that multiple times. And unfortunately, the point of that course is for everyone to leave it very scared and to be nervous. The point being that if you get nervous and scared by me and my fellow speaker, then maybe you'll
Yes.
be less so and have less problems, because the post-award period is when everything is truly at its riskiest, because you have a deal, it's in your hands, but you haven't made it happen. And there's so many things that can go wrong. And one of the things that's good and arguably bad about the housing credit is when things go wrong, they can go wrong irrevocably, hopelessly. And so knowing how that can happen and preventing against it is incredibly important to do.
Right. And things can go horribly wrong, but they don't, because all the
Right.
players involved, there's lots of checks and balances, which is why the credit's been so successful for 40 years. And there, I just like to always point out, I know that you agree with this, is the real key is understanding all the various deadlines, obviously striving to comply with them. And along the way, if there's an issue or something, surfacing the issue right away.
Yes.
Because it's remarkable how many issues can be resolved when they're surfaced early. And obviously, if they get surfaced very late, then they're less able to deal with them. But I certainly would say,
Absolutely.
as issues arise, I wouldn't panic too quickly. I'd just reach out to your professionals and say, okay, let me know how this should be handled.
Exactly. It's
I know you see a lot of new things every year, but most of what you see isn't new. Most of what you see is the things you've dealt with before.
Exactly. It's very tempting when something unfortunate happens to be embarrassed and want to just hide it and fix it
Right.
yourself. And that's just the wrong impulse. You got to
Yep.
bring in others to help figure out what to do.
So in terms of you being on the podcast today, I am saving the best for last, and that is, it's not just Mark. You also have fellow instructors from Novogradac and from the broader affordable housing community. So please share who your fellow instructors are over this 6-week period.
Right. We start in week 2 with our colleague, Stacy Gordon, who's in the Dover office and accountant, obviously. And she definitely helps make, you wouldn't think eligible basis could be an engaging, fun topic. And it's entirely possible that it wouldn't be, depending on his presentation, but she helps to make it actually worth listening to and interesting and fun. And maybe not fun, but definitely worth listening to it. And you pay attention because she has such a great way of presenting it and a good understanding of how all that works. So that is week 2. And then week 3 is someone who's new, who actually, I don't know that I've ever met, Sarah Wick, but as I understand it,
I do.
know her.
I was with her at 2 different events last week. It'll be a treat.
Absolutely.
Sarah is with a Related Midwest.
Exactly. Yes. So she
So a developer.
She was a recommendation to join. And so then for the equity class, we've got someone that is, mentioned how many times I've been on the podcast. If you were to keep track of who has been the most called upon speaker for Novogradac for various things, Kat Vilma would be in our top 10.
Yes.
I would imagine. And so with Redstone, and it's because everyone just loves her. She's just so great. And it's because she tells it like it is. She doesn't hold back. She just straight up shares what you need to know in a very frank, direct manner, which people really appreciate. And she's also a deep expert, knows exactly what she's talking about. So it's so we're very lucky to have her join.
No, you definitely are. And now's a time when there's so much focus on equity pricing for bond deals, 9% and all the rest. So having her, I'm sure there'll be a lot of folks who want to tune in just for that.
Absolutely. And then for QAPs, I have joining me someone with whom I worked in Georgia, who's now out on her own, Jill Cromartie with Simple Asset Management. And she's just one of the favorite people with whom I've ever gotten to work. She's just a true expert and has an excellent perspective on the topic and many other topics as well. And so I'm just really lucky to have her willing to join. And she also, when I can't speak to our basics class, the seminar one that we do before, she fills in for that and does a great job. I think sometimes they would rather have her than me because she's just excellent. And then last but definitely not least, for the post award is Tony Jackson. I've been doing the content with her for a long time, and she is a true expert. She's an attorney with the Banks law firm and has been doing this work. I shouldn't say how long. She can say how long, but it's been a little while, longer than me, I'll say. And it's just absolutely seen it all, just a true expert, and just has a very good way of presenting what you need to know about it and the important bottom lines.
That's great because you end up having a developer, you have a syndicator, you have the attorney, you have the accountant, you have a tax credit consultant. I wonder if they've all worked on a deal before together.
That's a great question. I know
You'll have to find out.
Exactly. I'm sure there's been some overlap, but if they all did work together, it would be the best deal ever. That's for sure.
You got that right. So anything else I should have asked you about that I haven't asked about yet about the upcoming 6-week course?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I think we've pretty well covered it. Just that I hear back from folks. I'll see them when I walk around, and I hesitate to say it because I don't like to sound braggy, but people really have taken a lot from it. The feedback has been very positive from folks and it's been worthwhile.
And that's one of the reasons why we're having you on today, because I've gotten so much positive feedback when I'm out and about from folks who have taken the course or planning to take the course or in the middle of taking the course, and they really enjoyed a lot. And so I wanted to make sure I gave the podcast listeners an opportunity to know about it. We provide a lot of trainings and the like. Sometimes people aren't aware of some of the stuff that we're doing. And also, if you could share a bit about your involvement with the Loan Detachment Working Group, as well as our upcoming housing conference in May, please share a little bit about that, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Yes, so I do get to be involved with the working group. It's definitely a worthwhile investment for pretty much anyone in our industry. It's a way to just stay on top of the latest. And it's also a chance to get to provide input to federal officials, which it's not like that happens every week, but when it happens, it can really matter. And so the biggest one, of course, was with average income. When that whole regulation came out and we needed to, as an industry, respond to it, that working group was one of the key voices in making sure that federal guidance got to be in a much better place than where it started. And you never know when that kind of thing will pop up. It's kind of like that great expression, Noah started building the ark long before it started raining. And so you really want to be in on things before they become crises. Being a member of the working group is a way to do that.
And it's also, they meet once a month and we're constantly dealing with breaking issues. So every meeting, there's 2 or 3 or 4 new things that are out there. You know, that it's a way of getting early information about issues that are out there that can help you potentially avoid issues later. So I definitely encourage developers, syndicators, and all the rest to have someone on their teams joining in once a month, because I have no doubt that they're learning about different issues that they weren't aware of before the call.
Exactly. And then I think you'd mentioned, as I remember,
our May conference will not be in San Francisco this year.
Right. It's very neat that it's going to be in San Diego. I'm looking forward to it. And what we just talked about, the basics, we cover a lot of that same content, in part because I'm involved in both. We cover the Wednesday before the conference. And so if what you have available is a day, then that's the way to do it, is to come to that conference. Or if you just want an excuse to come to San Diego. But then, of course, you also should stick around for the rest of the conference, because they're really great events, the way we put them on. Our team's really got that down to a science.
Excellent. So thank you, Mark. I appreciate you joining me for the podcast today. Please stick around for the off mic section. But before we go there, to our audience, if you're joining the podcast, please subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday on whichever platform you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment right now to like and comment on the episode. We really appreciate when you do that. It helps raise our visibility. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I know you're busy. And we also encourage our listeners to share episodes of Tax Credit Tuesday with their colleagues. And as I say most weeks, if you have any questions or topics you want us to address, in an upcoming episode, please contact us with those suggestions through the website. Now let's turn to the off mic section, where we get to use this space to give a shout out to others working in the tax credit and tax incentive communities. So Mark, who would you like to shout out?
Well, I'm going to name two individuals, but they're multiple colleagues that each of them has involved working on this, but they're the points of contact. And it's Kim Wilborn with the South Carolina State Housing Authority, and Michelle Murph, who's with the South Carolina State Department of Mental Health. And so the two of them and many others within their respective agencies have been working together. And it's actually not even just them, it's various developers, owners, property managers have all been working together to implement, and it's a long phrase, but you got to say it all, integrated permanent supportive housing. What the idea is that people with disabilities get referred to tax credit properties and they then get to live there. And it's folks that would be otherwise inappropriately in a group home, or maybe long-term crashing on someone's couch, or maybe even under a bridge somewhere. And so it's people that are in really desperate circumstances. And so the properties in South Carolina set aside a small percent, 10%, give or take, of their units for this population, if there's referrals available. And as I understand it, I've heard recently that they've gotten to where they've gotten 60 such households, mostly individuals, placed.
Wow.
And it's been a multi-year effort, and so there's going to be a bunch more in the near future. But it's just an example of how the housing credit can be a great resource to help all kinds of populations and serve all kinds of needs.
Excellent. I echo your shout out. Thanks to both for the work that you're doing. I also have a shout out. I'm going to shout out Novogradac's Director of Multifamily Property Compliance, Stephanie Knockin, a frequent guest of the podcast. And I'm giving her a shout out because the National Association of Home Builders recently announced that Stephanie Knockin is the 2025 Housing Credit Certified Professional, that's HCCP for short, of the year. So she's the HCCP of the year. This is a prestigious honor that the National Association of Home Builders uses to recognize Stephanie's outstanding leadership, expertise, and contributions to the affordable housing industry. So I wanted to take a moment to share those congratulations to Stephanie. I've obviously shared them with her directly, but I wanted to also share it with my audience and our audience. And please, if you know Stephanie, take a second to send her an email and tell her congratulations. She's definitely earned it.
Indeed, no doubt.
So thank you for being on the podcast today, Mark. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast, or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.